welcome to the MIPIM Connect session on analysing the UK real estate market post-COVID. This was a session that was originally planned, obviously, for MIPIM in Cannes back in March, and I think the topic was slightly different. It was actually analysing and charting the real estate market post-Brexit, but maybe we'll come to a bit of Brexit later on in the conversation if we have time for it. It almost makes a nice change to talk about Brexit rather than COVID. I'm joined by two very well qualified and opinionated panelists, Simon Williams and Colin Sinclair, and I'll let them give you a brief thumbnail about who they are and what they've done to justify being here. And I'll kick off with Colin Sinclair. Colin.
Thanks, Matt. Well, I'm chief exec of something new called Sciontec. It's a joint venture between Liverpool City Council, Liverpool's universities and Bruntwood Legal in General. It's a spin out of Liverpool's Knowledge Quarter, which covers roughly half Liverpool city centre. And we like to think it's becoming known as a world-leading innovation district. But Sciontec is there to develop and operate science and tech space. And you probably remember, Matt, prior to that, I was actually with Bruntwood, and prior to that, I ran Midas in Manchester. So Liverpool is my home city, but I am a big fan of the Northwest as a whole.
Absolutely, and if there's anyone with a better track record of trying to persuade money to come to a region, it's probably yourself. Simon.
Hi, I'm Simon Williams. I'm the head of national markets at BNP Paribas Real Estate in the UK. So essentially, I look after all of our commercial transaction teams other than the West End and the City, and tend to get a pretty good view about what's going on down in the depths of the markets around the country. In terms of my specialism, I've been dealing in investments for nearly 35 years now, both in the UK and overseas. And my main focus over the last few years has been putting together reasonably complicated forward funding structures on mixed-use developments in regeneration areas where we've been dealing with various stakeholders like local authorities, funds and developers around the country. So again, sort of trying to help the UK develop the sort of infrastructure from a real estate point of view that it will need going forward in the 21st century.
Brilliant. Well, thanks to you both for joining us today. And I think, we're going to try and sort of focus very much on looking forward, rather than looking back. But just one looking back question from me to kick off. At least theoretically, we should have had this conversation down near to the beach with the sun pouring down in Cannes back in March. And, had COVID not been the thing it has turned out to be, if I'd said to you, where would you be telling your clients, or where do you think the sort of best growth areas might be in UK property going ahead back then, what would you have said? Because I really want to explore over the course of this conversation whether things have actually changed. And I guess from the investment advisor point of view, Simon, what were you punting as your top buys in the UK back then?
Yeah, I think we were all sort of feeling very optimistic about 2020. We'd had a general election which had come out with a decisive result. No matter what your politics are, it's always better to have a decisive result, I think, especially given the backdrop of the last few years in Westminster and the impacts that's had on confidence and markets. So we were pretty optimistic that actually, despite Brexit and all the other uncertainties, we were actually heading into a period where we thought that confidence was going to be there for people to actually start putting their money into the UK real estate market. The areas that were obviously prospering were all the ones that we'll probably talk about going forward, actually, Matt. So I think, logistics, obviously very, very strong with what's happening in the retail world and with the way people buy online, but also what some people call the sort of livings market or the beds market. So anything where you sort of not only spend the day, but the night also in a property. That includes things like BTR and students and healthcare and so on. All those areas were areas that I think were beginning to sort of attract the attention of mainstream investors, and I think that they were all due to have rather a good run, and that would have been where a lot of optimistic cash was going.
Brilliant. And Colin, I have a sneaking suspicion that probably you would have said the same thing back then as you're going to say today, but what were you excited about back in, or would you have been excited about sort of pre-COVID?
I think there's an expression, isn't there? The things that you were really good at when you go into a crisis, or when a crisis starts, should be the things that you focus on when you come out of it. Because if they were good before, the odds are they're going to be the good things now. But it's not always the case. So as you would expect, having completed the Sciontec deal with Brumwood Legal in General during the lockdown, the most phenomenal legal exercise ever done from a person's dining table. Quite a challenge to get that level of complexity done at that point. But those things like health and life sciences, anything around integrated data, we all know from track and trace and all this stuff how important personalised health and data is going to be. Materials chemistry, it's not just about those hand gels, it's that whole world of what people like Unilever do in materials chemistry, but also tech, modern methods of house building and manufacturing, which can be done with social distancing in factories and delivered completed to sites. Things like robotics, you can now automate labs purely on robots and not have to worry about social distancing. So all of that, I think, was really important as we went into lockdown, and will probably be the key growth areas, along with the likes of logistics, food processing, food manufacturing going forward. However, there's another side to it. The students aren't coming back to universities in great numbers. Many universities are operating remotely. The biggest income to most of our big universities was international students, and that's gone. So I think we'll see an impact of that on the market in two ways. There'll certainly be an impact on the student residential market, but they will also be a significant impact, I think, on probably what's most important to many of us, which is culture, leisure, hospitality, because they won't be that same spend in our big cities.
Well, I guess that probably leads straight into the question that perhaps is most difficult to answer, which is the one about behavioural change. And I think there's a lot of discussion across the retail, logistics, office world about are shoppers, workers, employers going to behave differently, students, as you say. Simon, where do you stand on behavioural change? Do you buy that this has been a sea change event and we're all, there is a new normal?
I think that human beings really are a very sociable species, and I don't think that even with all the sort of social distancing and so on that we're doing at the moment, that comes naturally to people. I think that people will value the interaction that they get with others and in groups of various sizes. So I think personally that it's going to take a long time for us to get back to normal, but I do think we will get back to something approaching normal, but that obviously will only be if it's safe. And clearly we're in the hands of people producing vaccines and so on to see if that can happen. So if it's not safe, then I think there may be a new normal, at least for a long time, until we develop some sort of herd immunity, which might take years. But I think if we can get back to, on a safe basis, to being able to interact and so on, my view is that that's what we like to do, and in many ways that's our kind of secret weapon as a species. That's why we've evolved so far, because we like to cooperate and talk and be together. So that's sort of looking at it from a very big picture point of view. If you look at what some of the people involved in some of the areas that have been hit most severely are saying, so for example, the executives that run the sort of big hotels and so on, well, I think what they're saying is that across the hotel board, and obviously the hotel industry's been pretty devastated, but I think they're sort of thinking that they'll be back to sort of 2019 levels of trade and occupancy probably by 2023. Although the budget guys are saying that they're anticipating probably by the end of next year being back to where they were in 2019. And that's probably quite a good barometer, I think, for maybe where other sectors will go that rely upon people being together. And that I think goes for things like the office sector as well, and the restaurant and hospitality sector.
Mm. And Colin, you touched on the fact that obviously some bits of your brief, probably almost completely unaffected, perhaps even boosted by COVID-19, but other bits perhaps such as the sort of the cultural offer that's made the rejuvenation of Liverpool recently surely have got to be challenged over the short to medium term.
Oh, hugely. For a city like Liverpool and many other UK regional cities, we are facing a whole new economic paradigm. And it's as Simon says, if there is a vaccine, if it's as simple as an annual flu jab, then I think there will be those budgets that the hotel market are talking about are probably realistic. If it's like the cold and it just comes around and you catch it again and again, then we are facing quite surreal and different times. But I think you can only ever plan on what you can control yourself. And I'm an eternal optimist. I always believe that there is a way through anything. So I think there are challenges. I've done a little bit to help with Liverpool's economic recovery plan, which is being taken forward soon. And I think you have to concentrate on what your economy is really good at. What are the differentiating factors? And for a city like Liverpool and many other UK regional cities, those differences are important. But we need to look at what government does as well. Devolution to the regions, as we've seen with Scotland and Wales, and as I think we should see more of with places like the Northwest, that is really important. But it's what central government does that's going to be critical as well. I don't think they should over-centralise decision making. And I think that relationship going forward between government nationally and locally and the private sector, and I include the universities in the private sector, that's going to be absolutely critical as we map our way forward. Nobody's got the solution now, but we'll only get there through a bit of innovation and a lot of partnership.
That's a really interesting point, because I wrote a blog, I think, or a piece for the sort of MIPIM magazine back in about February, saying that I thought North Shoring was back. The UK Treasury was talking about moving a lot of its functions to the regions. Even Goldman Sachs had requirements out in the market for sort of a regional high tech centre. You were probably bidding for it at the time, Colin. It felt like there was a moment, there was more chat about sort of, spending on infrastructure, and, whereas, the sort of the slightly pessimistic side of me might say, well, some of this was just about, being seen to repay Workington Man voting Boris Johnson. But it did feel like we were pushing towards a moment where the government and corporate attention was swinging away from London and the Southeast. I guess, obvious question for you, Colin, is, do you think anything has changed? The government quite rightly has spent a huge amount of money. Some people have estimated, 10 times what's been spent on sorting the GFC out. Surely this means there's less money for regional infrastructure. The growth story may not be quite as attractive going ahead for the regions.
I don't think you can underestimate the importance of this, and in many ways the competitive advantage that perhaps the Scotland and Wales and the devolved administrations have for inward investment alone, where they've got that local decision making and that funding ability. And for key parts of England, it's going to be really important that kind of level of devolution follows, because no one knows better how to fix the health issues in a place, or the skills agenda, or, as you mentioned, infrastructure and transport. No one knows that better than those local devolved administrations, city regions, counties as they were, and cities, the big cities. I think that's really important. But I think what we've seen, and I always think that whatever people's politics, you should really create a positive dialogue with government. And from what I've seen is, in a period of crisis, governments tend to pull back to the centre. They become quite wary and suspicious, and they stop sharing. And so I think what we've got to see now is for the government to follow through on those earlier promises about levelling up, about infrastructure investment outside of London and the South East, and everybody will see the benefits from that. But I think that's going to be a key thing that we'll see go one way or the other in the coming weeks and months.
Pulling back
I
to
mean,
centre's a lovely way of putting it. Simon, investors
yeah,
do
I
the
was going
same,
to say,
don't they?
yeah, I was just about to make that point, actually, Matt. I think London is a world city. It's one of the best
Oh, yeah.
cities in the world. We all agree with that. And obviously, when people are worried about the economy and the future, they tend to sort of look at the argument, let's invest in where we know has succeeded historically year after year after year. So I think to a certain extent, London will be fine. It'll have its issues, I'm sure, but on the whole, it will continue to prosper and still be a major target, both for domestic and for overseas investment. I think for the regions, I think this, and I agree actually with what everybody's been saying, I do agree that it's a more complicated picture there. I think the main focus will be from domestic investors. L&G have been doing a great job. Obviously, Colin's done a deal with them in lockdown. So have I, as it happens, in Sheffield at Westbar, where we've signed the pre-funding agreement on a 150 million scheme, where the council have been involved, and where Urbo, a local developer, has been involved, and L&G are basically forward funding to office blocks, a BTR and a car park. So, they've continued to show faith, and it's the Future Cities Fund again. And I think other domestic investors will show faith, but will need to know that they have the backing of both local and central government to do that. So really, to deliver on some of these projects that have been planned and worked on for a very long time now, and which are key parts of creating that infrastructure, and by that I mean the sort of working environments and living environments that people are going to need to be attracted to these places. The government can't not continue to support it and allow local authorities to continue to support it, because if they do, then things will very soon unwind, and obviously that's no good for the recovery of the UK, and also for that levelling up agenda, which has been so important, I think, for the sort of Boris Johnson project. So without being party political, I think it would be very sad if they sort of reneged on some of those things that they've been promising to do.
What I've always said, just one additional point on that, what I've always said about this is city regions can't go to government with a begging bowl. It's not saying we're in a mess, come and fund us. There has to be an evidential base. And if the regions concentrate on where they are genuinely world class at something and what differentiates them, and where they can go to government and say, look, we fixed this, or we had success with this before the pandemic. If you invest in it now, we'll give you X times return on that investment. I don't think government should be able to turn that down, because it's evidence-based and a clear return for the benefit of the whole of the UK. So, I think where you see those investments, where the Bruntvoods, the Legal and Generals, and many others too are doing that, is where the local government can persuade them that they have a vision for the future, and there's some evidence behind that the numbers are real. I think that's really important.
It's sort of, inward investment is the really what you've championed for most of your career, Colin. Chasing after these relatively footloose requirements, be they, investment cash or just operational businesses, everyone's chasing them, everyone's presenting their cases, everyone's saying it's a great place to live and we retain all our graduates. Does it slightly, do sometimes perhaps local authorities take their eyes a bit off the ball of the 98, 99% of the companies which are local? It does slightly worry me when I see everyone chasing these sort of handful of footloose requirements. Would it just be better to build build on your local strength?
I think I'll just go first on this, Simon. I think that's a great point. And if you were to talk to Joe Anderson, Tony Reeves in Liverpool, they will talk about the importance of those large firms. And I think Liverpool has done very well on that, largely with the absence of inward investment, where Manchester has clearly been much more geared up to benefit from that. But the large firm part of it, the growing the indigenous businesses, is massively important. But so too is the startups and the spin-outs, and that relationship, that interaction with the university academics, the hospital clinicians, and getting that startup spin-out innovation economy going forward. And that comes back into much of the work in the Knowledge Quarter and Sciontec. But You can't survive without inward investment. Inward investment brings new ideas, new practices, new money. I think it's about getting a balance between those large firms, those startups and SMEs, and having the inward investment to bring in the higher skilled jobs that grow the overall economic base of a city or region. But I do completely agree with you. You spend too much time chasing inward investment and ignore what you've already got. That's a big mistake.
Simon, and you probably handhold a lot of these footloose investors, trying to decide between Edinburgh or Manchester or Birmingham or Liverpool. Do you think they're going to be looking for anything different post-COVID?
I think, putting to one side the comment I made earlier about they'll probably want a bit more flexibility because it's hard to predict how much space you're going to need. I think the fundamentals will remain fairly unchanged, and that's going to be the quality of the workforce, the quality of the working environment available. Is there the sort of building that people will want, and obviously all the things that surround that, including are there the right partners to work with, depending on what business sector you're in, and that could be higher education in the university sector, or the local authority and the influence that they might have on what they can put together to get people into towns and cities. So it's a combination of the usual things, which include workforce environment and the right sort of working relationships with the organisations that are already based there.
Now, there's been some debate, going back to the behavioural change point, or it was quite considerable debate over the last sort of month or so about perhaps the need for city centres, with big companies as diverse as Barclays and Facebook saying, significant proportions of their staff are going to be working from home forever. If people aren't going into the CBDs to work, they're not going into the CBDs to shop. The most expensive retail becomes even less desirable. It probably redraws distribution models, urban logistics, which was perhaps the hottest part of the traditional commercial property sectors, becomes maybe not quite so hot. For an investor looking at the UK, or indeed property from right out there, has the hierarchy of what's good been completely redrawn? Simon, do you think we're looking at a fundamental change in what falls into the core value add opportunistic boxes, or is this just the middle of a crisis, we're all flanneling about a bit?
I think we're looking at it in the midst of the crisis, and your view about what the future might hold tends to be rather distorted by the immediacy of the crisis that you're going through. I think that, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, that if we can do it safely, the instinct of humans will be to congregate and do things together. I think city centres will probably continue to have a lot more people living in them, and that will support some of the infrastructure. I mean, retail's in a changing environment, but there'll still be some need for it. Certainly convenience retailing, and then things like restaurants and cafes and so on. But I suspect that you're right. It might be that people come in not every day, but maybe 3 or 4 days a week, and now they've proven that they can work effectively from home, work from home for a bit as well. So there will be changes. Maybe the commute won't be quite as crowded, but I think there's still going to be a pretty critical role for city centres going forward. Although we shouldn't be saying this in a debate like this, but it is probably a bit too early to say. I'll avoid that phrase.
Colin, are you optimistic about or pessimistic, or just everything will stay the same about sort of the role of the city?
In the short term, nobody knows, do they? We're going to go through a period of uncertainty that we can only approach with a positive attitude, I think. But I think the drive to urbanism will continue, and globally and in the UK. And as much as there are some very good out-of-town locations, I think the move away from cars and from carbon-polluting forms of transport will be increasing. And we've all been outside and seen how fantastic the air is and how nature's returning. And I think people have had a little bit of a glimpse of a less polluting, better future. I read on Sunday that we didn't use any coal-fired power stations of the country at all in the last 54 days. So things have changed a little bit. But I think that drive to city centres will continue. I think business locations next to main transport links will be attractive to investors. Upper Central in Liverpool, between Lime Street Station, that safety net of the train back to London, and Central Station, which I believe has the busiest underground platform in the country, those areas in amongst transport, I think, will continue to be really attractive. And you know, what's quite interesting is I think we have to invest in place and leisure and hospitality and all those cultural things. We have to. They've been really badly hit. But humans, as Simon says, are social animals. And however much we can all enjoy using Zoom and working from home and spending time in our gardens or out running, we will need to interact with other people. Great innovation happens when people meet together. I don't know how much is happening on Zoom, but it definitely happens when people socially interact. So I think we need to keep our cities attractive. We need to get the students back when we can. That will create the graduates, that will create the talent pool, that will grow the large firms and bring in the inward investors. So I think city centres still have a very strong future, particularly if we're going to manage our carbon footprints better.
That's a very good point. So I'm conscious that we're pushing towards the back end of our allotted half an hour for this MIPIM Connect session. So I thought I'd just bring it right back to the cold hard world of property investment and say, well, you know, if you're a MIPIM Connect viewer watching this perhaps from outside the UK, what would you both recommend sort of post-COVID? Let's assume we're out of lockdown, things are returning relatively normal. Maybe your sort of favourite area geographically or sectorally for a risk-averse buyer, and then what you think perhaps the most interesting opportunistic deal might be. And I guess probably, Simon, this is your meat and drink, so we'll start with you on that, if I may.
Yeah, I go back to, I know probably I shouldn't say this, but you can't go too far wrong if you buy in prime London, because it's a world-class city and it will always perform, and there will always be an appetite from investors in London as a city and as a location. So I think there's a lot to be said for concentrating on your knitting there. I think regionally, I'm with Colin. I think the big cities will do well. I also think that some of the not so fashionable cities will also do well, because they've just been working so hard at trying to get their offer right. So the Sheffields and Newcastles and Liverpools and so on, they're great cities, and I think they're now beginning to emerge as proper commercial centres that investors are taking seriously. So I think those will do well. In terms of where do I think there'll be some good opportunities in a sector that fundamentally will recover long term, I suspect the hotel sector will get hit quite hard as a result of what's going on, but I do think it will bounce back. People do like to travel, whether it's for business or for pleasure. And I think that people at least know if things like hygiene and cleanliness are going to be at a premium, that, you know, if you stay in a hotel, it's been professionally looked after, as opposed to, you know, something like an Airbnb where, I mean, it's a great organisation and a great service, but you are staying in somebody's house. So I think that actually that will help those sorts of attitudes that, you know, are changing at the moment to the environment that you're in and how well it's looked after, might help that sector bounce back quite quickly. So I think over the next 12 to 18 months, there's probably going to be some good opportunities there to buy a sort of slightly repriced number that will look like it was a good idea in 2 or 3 years' time, if what the hotel sector is forecasting is correct, and that's that they get back to sort of 2019 levels by 2023. So that would be my tip for where to do a little bit of shopping, I think.
Lovely. And Colin, your top tips for a risk-averse investor, and maybe one who's looking for something a bit more exciting.
Well, I've written down Simon's, and I'll be following that advice as always. So in London, absolutely, global city, world city, and so important. In terms of northern cities, I would look at where there's a concentration of research-led universities and a large graduate talent pool. So Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, Newcastle, all fantastic cities. If I was an investor looking at something maybe a slightly riskier, but with a better return, I would focus on wherever there is innovation. because in any crisis, there's opportunity. And there will be some brilliant entrepreneurs and researchers and businesses out there who have seized that opportunity right now. And, you know, if you were looking at anybody working on infectious disease, there's a reason why Bill Gates has put tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds into Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine and the University of Liverpool. So infectious disease, health tech, I think is going to be a real growing market going forward. And anything around personalized data, integrated data. We mentioned that earlier, but you know, if we're going to control and prevent future pandemics, we need better, quicker, more accurate, localized data. And I think that's going to be a massive market in the future.
Excellent, thank you very much. So I think wrapping up, we all feel that you know, the UK is still full of opportunities for property investors. Some of the opportunities are the same as they were before the crisis, and some new opportunities, as Colin was just saying, have emerged. Some rising stars out there, which I think was a particularly interesting point. Don't just focus on the obvious locations. Don't just go for that safety bet of, you know, betting on the big cities. There's some rising stars and some local towns and small cities that are really getting their act in order. But I think, you know, generally I'm feeling a lot more optimistic than I did 30 minutes ago. Colin, Simon, thank you very much for your time this morning, and I hope everyone finds this conversation interesting. Thank you very much.